what is the problem we're trying to solve? This is a question and a task that a whole series of partners have worked on together over the last 2 years. And I'd like to start the conversation by basically saying, I think we would all agree that consumers, both here locally, across Canada and around the world, are increasingly wanting to know more about the sustainability of agriculture and food. This is happening across all countries, and I think one of the challenges, however, is that there is really not a key way to benchmark or to demonstrate that sustainability for the marketplace. And this is having, I believe, profound implications for our competitiveness, to add value from producers to processors, retailers across the country. But by improving transparency, I think, around our performance, this is a way that we can be far more successful, build trust in the marketplace here and abroad. So this is the problem we're trying to solve. Essentially, how do we demonstrate, are we a sustainable food system? And this is the basic question that a number of partners and players across the country have focused on. Next slide, please. So a coalition of partners have come together, as I mentioned, to develop Canada's first Agri-Food Sustainability Index. And this is, as was kindly introduced, this is about affirming Canadian leadership in this space. It's about determining how we can leverage this for opportunities in the workplace, improve competitiveness, but importantly, it's also about how we mark progress and demonstrate how we're addressing shortcomings, environmental or social, across the sector from agriculture to retail. As well, this is about a way or a tool that the partners believe can truly inform how policy is made, decision-making, influence the research and innovation agenda, and effectively help drive strategy. This is harder to understand, but it's something that we are focused on. Next slide, please. So I say we, and we have now 85 partners who are part of this initiative. These partners are from production agriculture, from the input sector. They include processors, retailers, 3 levels of government, municipal, provincial, including MAPAC, and federal. It is also representing banks, other financial institutions, innovation organizations, environmental and social NGOs, not-for-profit organizations, as well as many other players, as you can see from this list. The list is not perfect. We do want to have more players involved in this, so we're not suggesting that this is perfectly inclusive. However, it is driving a common intent. It's one of the first initiatives that, as one of our researchers said, has really started to break down the silos across the agri-food sector, all with a common intent around how do we benchmark sustainability. Importantly, these players have contributed financial support and support in kind in order to commit to this project. It's not controlled by any one entity. It is a pre-competitive and collaborative effort to try to improve how we benchmark sustainability across the country in a consolidated way from production to retail. So this is quite an effort, and I really want to thank the many organizations here and also the consulting team that we've had part of our work across this project as well. So a lot of people have put in a lot of time. I should also add, and I forgot, because once you start to list people, it also includes our academic partners as well. Next slide, please. So I'm not going to describe in detail this slide. It's probably very small print for you, but to say that we are part of a process of phases that started in early 2020. We're now in a phase that's coming to a conclusion next month in May. And as you can see, the number of partners have grown from about 22 initially to 85, as I mentioned. And we are just building a series of understanding and insight at every phase. Where we're going after May, we are hoping to launch a pilot for this initiative, and I'll explain that a little bit later, in order to really make this an institutional structure or to have a permanent place where we can mark progress and become more sophisticated about how we measure sustainability. Next slide, please. Yes, thank you. Okay, so let's just step back for a second and understand, well, what are we really talking about here? What is this? So you can see we have 4 sustainability blocks: the environment, the economic sustainability, health and food safety, and societal well-being. We're taking a holistic view of sustainability across these 4 domains or blocks. We're looking at sustainability, however, between agriculture and retail. This is about emphasizing outcomes-based metrics. There's an issue here because we want to demonstrate with evidence how we are delivering on sustainability as opposed to using survey-based data, for example. We need to align with global goals, such as the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. There are a host of others on biodiversity. There are social inclusion goals and so forth, the March to Net Zero. And we want to align with national, Canadian, and provincial goals that are relevant and important. As well, we want to hopefully use this not to dictate who should measure sustainability. This is not about being prescriptive. We're not saying to a farmer or to a food company, here is what you need to measure. Actually, we prefer not to, because I think the best opportunity is for us to provide a consolidated view of sustainability. To answer that question at the beginning, how do we know that Canada's agri-food system is sustainable? So we need to provide that consolidated view. This is also an opportunity to help by raising the bar on disclosure, by showing the criteria to measure sustainability across those 4 blocks, that hopefully this will help nudge up or improve disclosure and sustainability reporting all across the sector. And this may hopefully better align the agri-food sector in order to back up the claims you and others want to make around sustainability. So this is what this consists of. We are not comparing countries or provinces. That perhaps could be done down the road, but this is not the intent now, nor are we measuring consumer diet choices, because that gets into social policy and economic policy. And so there are some limitations as to what we can possibly measure. Next slide, please. So the point then of the work that we're undertaking right now, that is from October to May, is very focused. It is about how do we develop the indicators, the sub-indicators, and the metrics behind each of these 4 blocks. And I'm going to give you an indication of that in a minute. We also want to determine how can we ensure credibility of this process. The last thing we want to do is to create a bias that ends up being subject to greenwashing or undue criticism. And we want to figure out how do we leverage this for value in the marketplace, for producers, for companies, and in the policy landscape. And finally, we want to build momentum to set up this pilot that I mentioned earlier in the next phase of work. And the 85 partners and our team that helped to develop the work, our consultancy and research team, have been focused on these particular objectives. Next slide. Okay, if I were to sort of take all of this complexity and boil it down, there are really 2 fundamental tasks. we are trying to prioritize how to benchmark an entire sector of the Canadian economy, agri-food. This is a huge undertaking, and so we don't want to create an index that's 1,000 pages long. No one will use it. It will be too much. So how do we know what is pertinent to measure, what's truly important, and what is truly material to the marketplace, to investors, to customers, buying customers, and ultimately consumers, and even to regulators? This is a process that we have been going through to understand and triage what is important. At the same time, we've been trying to understand what is the outcome. How do we demonstrate performance on sustainability that is credible, that can be useful, and that can actually be used to help support the claims we make in the marketplace? This is how we're bookending or creating the opportunity to deliver on this initiative and drive up alignment across all these many stakeholders. Next, please. So this is a detailed slide, but I will very quickly go over what have we accomplished in the last several months. Well, our final report is coming out next month, but I will give you some indication as to what's happening. We have doubled the number of partners involved in our work. We have framed up about 20 indicators and 50 sub-indicators. This might change a little bit before we issue our report, but it shows you the breadth of sustainability that we're measuring. And I should truly compliment the partners here, such as CITAC, le Conseil de la Transformation Alimentaire de Québec, was a co-lead on one of our projects and really helped us to refine our thinking. We're also identified a first, a sector first. For the first time, it seems, the partners have agreed on what are the data gaps. We don't and can't measure everything, and just having a list of what we are missing is actually a huge step forward. And so understanding those gaps are critical to identifying the metrics we need. We've also started to understand, through the help of some of our consulting team, such as Group Agricoles, on the limitations of what we can measure and what we can go forward on. By how do we address these gaps? How do we get at the granularity of data? How do we know how to share data across the sector to use at an aggregate level? How can we best review our practices globally going forward? We did so with academia and for global organizations in the last couple of months, such as with the World Benchmarking Alliance and the World Business Council on Sustainable Development, among some others. And we use that input to refine our thinking. Next slide. We also, and sorry again for the detail, but we also achieved over the last several months some really helpful insights on how to build and improve consumer trust and transparency, and also to how, again, to align to global best practice. I think we found some really important insights on how to affirm our potential in policymaking, and we had another research team involved in that, including the l'Institut Canadien des Politiques Agroalimentaires, or ICPA, or CAPI in English. They were part of understanding how do we bring better evidence that can inform the federal, provincial, territorial policy framework, trade advocacy, social inclusion, and innovation policy. A really important part of our work was involved in understanding how investors are changing the way they assess risk in the marketplace. Every single day in the news and in social media, we're seeing something about ESG, in English, environmental, social, governance factors. The federal budget is isolating how to get banks to assess risk on climate disclosures. We have taken a look at how we can use our work to inform ESG assessments. We're also setting out a governance roadmap and a data collection roadmap in our work to help us guide forward. And finally, we are ready to start moving forward, if we can get our final steps in order, about how we might launch a pilot to demonstrate this value. So in 8 months, our partners and our research team have really pulled together a lot. Next slide, please. This just gives you one indication of what the scope of this index will look like. I have not delineated all the indicators and sub-indicators that will be in our work, or the metrics in our work next month. But these are the themes that are associated with, at this point, this could change, but the themes associated with the 4 sustainability blocks. Nothing here should truly be a surprise. So under environment, we're looking at climate change impact, healthy soil, water, biodiversity, looking at safe food. We are including the viability, the financial viability and sustainable growth of the sector. If companies and farms are not profitable and successful, they cannot deliver on sustainability objectives for society. So economic sustainability is fundamental. And how we address a variety of social and diversity issues is becoming more and more important to our society and globally, and we need to address that. And as you can see, this index aligns with a number of UN Sustainable Development Goals. Next slide, please. So at the end of the day, we can come up with a really interesting list of indicators and benchmarks, but the question is, how do we demonstrate value? What's the potential if we leverage it? And what are some of the limitations of this index if we don't? And so among all of our work, we tried to boil this down into 4 groups. So the first slide, please. Again, it's detailed, but I'm going to run through this. The value of this index seems to be rooted or focused on one key thing: how we back up the claims we make about sustainability. I am not going to review all of this, but I highlight in yellow a few ideas or a few observations. The first one being government itself is saying that it wants to be the most sustainable food system around the planet. And so for federal, provincial, and territorial governments to make that claim, to express that vision, they need data to demonstrate that. And hopefully the index will be the basis to do so. We're also looking at how our work can be, before you jump ahead, actually just go back. We are also looking at how our work can be used in trade markets to advance Canada's exports. Countries and regions such as the European Union are demanding sustainability credentials are met in order to demonstrate proper responsible use of inputs, of practices in order to get access to market. This index is a possible way to do so. And I mentioned ESG. Now, while the index does not provide a credit check on individual farms or producers, what the index will provide is a view of systemic risk facing the sector that could help inform credit and access to capital decisions. The next slide talks about another key value driver, and this is about valuing innovation, collaboration. Next slide, please. And this really is something that is intangible. It's hard to put your finger on it, but it's become so very evident in all of our discussions that by working together across from producers to retail, all levels of government, academia, and innovation organizations, we are looking at benchmarks that we believe can inform policymaking. And by stakeholders aligning on data gaps, as I mentioned, this is one of the first times we've seen this where this may help inform how that evidence can be put together. Next slide. While those are important opportunities, there are big limitations, almost the flip side of that. And that is, if we don't get the right data, we will be unable to fulfill all of these areas of potential on the left. And that is that if we don't have the right outcomes-based data, if it's not credible, if we can't aggregate data from different sources, and finally, we need to ensure, the bottom point, that this index is comparable to global requirements, then we can't use that in the marketplace to the right effect. The last limitation is we need to ensure, in the next slide, we need to ensure credibility. And this is about having a far more inclusive governance structure to manage the index process. I mentioned we have 85 partners. We need greater representation. We cannot have every person around the table, every organization. That would make it decision-making impossible. However, we need a process that reaches out to other players. But this is critical in order to build trust. As well, we need to ensure that the messages we develop finally from this index pilot, for example, are balanced. We can't only talk about where Canada leads, and we are a global leader in many areas of sustainability, but we also face some pressures, environmental, social, and we face shortcomings. We need to be balanced in the messaging. And finally, just to pull out another example, is that we may find we may need to develop some protocols or some standards to help align the players and be transparent about how our processes work in order to build that credibility even further. And there's other ideas that we have. Finally, the last slide is that our next steps. I mentioned that our report, which will be translated, will be coming out, we believe, at the end of May. We are now thinking through how our pilot needs to be framed up, how we will include more players, how we will make effective choices to launch this, and we are open to having new partners be part of this. And what's critical is that we want to create and build on a plan that truly can expand our reach to be far more effective, to maintain that collaborative spirit, and that we are able to furnish an index or provide an index that provides some utility to the players, to government, to financial institutions and academia, researchers and others, so it is more credible and useful going forward. Merci beaucoup.